Last winter, my sister, her husband, my hostile friend, and I decided to spend a weekend at a cabin deep in the woods. We thought it would be a nice way to get away from everything, maybe go on a short hike, and just enjoy the peace. The drive up took us along a winding mountain road, with bare trees on both sides and a gray sky hanging low. The cabin itself was small, with floors that creaked and a stale smell in the air, but it was enough for what we needed. That first night, nothing strange happened. We made a small fire to keep warm, but when the wind picked up, it started howling around the cabin, shaking the walls. We brushed it off and eventually went to sleep, each of us in a separate corner of the cabin. Early the next morning, I woke up to a strange noise outside. It was faint, like a slow, crunching sound, as if someone was walking on the frozen ground. I stayed still, trying to listen. My friend was sleeping on the floor beside me, out cold, but the sound kept getting closer, creeping up toward the cabin walls. As dawn came, I went outside to check. The snow around the cabin had fresh footprints in it, too many to belong to any of us. They were spaced like someone had been pacing in circles around the cabin. I followed them a little way into the trees but stopped when I noticed they went nowhere and just looped back to the cabin. When I got back inside, my sister was already up and looked uneasy. She had heard the same crunching sound outside during the night and thought it was one of us. We told her it wasn't, and we agreed to stay alert the next night, just to be safe. That night, I stayed up with my friend. We sat quietly in the dark, listening. Every little creak and whisper from the wind set us on edge. Eventually, we heard the sound again, faint footsteps moving around the cabin, right outside the windows. This time, I peeked out through a gap in the curtain, but there was nothing there. We could hear it clearly, like someone was right outside, but the yard was empty. No shadows, no sign of anything that could be making the sound. The next morning, we found thin scratches on the cabin walls. They hadn't been there the day before. The footprints were back too, circling the cabin even more. That was when the fear really started to set in. By the third night, none of us could sleep. My brother-in-law suggested we leave early in the morning. But as the night dragged on, the footsteps returned, louder and heavier this time. They moved right up to the front door, then around to the back and kept circling. We were all inside, wide awake, barely even breathing. Right before dawn, the sounds stopped suddenly, leaving an eerie silence. It was so quiet it felt worse than the footsteps. We packed up quickly in the morning, all of us pretending like nothing had happened. But as we were leaving, I noticed something on the window. In the frost covering the glass was a single handprint, smeared like it had been dragged down the window. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that something had been there, just out of sight, watching us, feeding off our fear. I never went back to that cabin. None of us did. But sometimes, in the quiet of night, I hear those same slow footsteps circling, coming closer and closer, as if whatever was out there followed me back, waiting. Working alone at a border post in a small cabin far from the nearest town was mostly quiet and dull. My station was just a simple, old building, surrounded by thick trees that stretched far on both sides of the border. Nights were usually silent, with just the sound of the wind moving through the branches. That night, though, felt colder than usual. The sky was heavy with clouds, and a low fog covered everything outside. My job was simple: watch the cameras, check any cars that came by, and report anything unusual. But unusual rarely happened out here. Usually it was just routine checks or an animal wandering too close. But for some reason, something felt off that night. As the hours dragged on, one of the motion detectors on the south side started blinking. I figured it was probably just an animal, but I glanced at the camera feed just to be sure. All I saw were trees and shadows shifting in the thick fog. Nothing to worry about, I thought, and I went back to my work. About an hour later, the detector went off again. This time, when I looked at the camera, I noticed a faint shape, almost like a person but blurred by the mist. I couldn't make out any details, but it looked like it was just outside the reach of the camera, standing in a shadowy area where the trees were thickest. I kept my eyes on the monitor, waiting for the shape to move, but it just stayed there. Minutes passed, and it didn't budge. Eventually, I told myself it was probably just the fog playing tricks and forced myself to look away. Later that night, the same detector went off again. When I checked the feed, the shape was closer this time. It still hid in the shadows, but I could make out the outline of a person, just standing there watching the cabin. My stomach knotted, and I turned on the floodlights outside, hoping to scare off whoever, or whatever it was. But when the lights came on, there was nothing there. No figure, no shadows, just the same trees and thick fog. The detector went silent, and for a while I thought it was over. But as I started to settle back in, I heard footsteps outside. They were faint but steady, moving around the cabin in slow, steady circles. I froze, my heart pounding as I listened. The steps stopped right outside the door, and then there was complete silence. After a long, tense minute, I heard the footsteps move away, fading back into the trees. I checked the cameras, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever it was. But again, there was nothing. The rest of my shift was a tense wait, each sound making my skin crawl. When dawn finally broke, I stepped outside, still feeling on edge, and checked around. The ground was cold and covered in a thin frost, but there, circling the cabin, were footprints. They were clear human footprints. They circled the cabin and then headed off into the trees, stopping right at the edge of the camera's view, right where I'd first seen the shadow. I followed the prints into the forest, but they suddenly stopped, as if whoever made them had just disappeared into thin air. I went back inside and locked the door, but that uneasy feeling didn't leave me. I finished my shift and left the cabin as soon as the next officer showed up. I didn't mention the footsteps or the figure. Something about it felt too strange, too hard to explain. A few months later, I heard that another officer had been stationed there. He lasted only a week. He said the place gave him the creeps and refused to say more. But I knew exactly what he meant. I'd felt it too. The cold, quiet presence just beyond the trees, waiting, watching. And deep down, I knew it was still out there, somewhere in those dark woods, waiting for the next poor soul to come along. I decided to spend the weekend alone at a cabin deep in the woods. It was far from everyone, which was exactly what I needed. Work had drained me, and I thought some quiet time alone would help me clear my head. The cabin was old, but it seemed solid enough, with thick walls and strong locks. The first day was calm. I spent hours reading, cooking simple meals, and walking around the cabin. As night started to fall, dark clouds rolled in, heavy with rain. Soon, I heard the first few drops, which quickly turned into a downpour. I could hear the rain hammering down on the roof, the wind rushing through the trees, and every so often, a loud crash of thunder that made the walls shake. The storm had me a little tense, but I tried to push it aside. I told myself it was just the quiet getting to me, nothing more. But as the hours went by, a strange feeling crept in, something I couldn't ignore. Felt like I wasn't alone out there. A sense of unease crept over me, like something was watching from somewhere nearby, hidden by the shadows and rain. Around midnight, the power went out, plunging the cabin into complete darkness, except for flashes of lightning that lit up the room for brief moments. I scrambled for my flashlight and lit a few candles I'd brought just in case. I kept telling myself it was just the storm, Nothing unusual. But my nerves were on edge. Then I heard it. A faint sound from outside, just barely louder than the rain. Footsteps. Slow, heavy, and way too close. I held my breath, hoping it was just some animal. But the steps sounded too careful, too deliberate. I felt a chill crawl down my spine as I realized that someone, or something, was circling the cabin, moving slowly, step by step, around its edges. The footsteps would stop every few seconds, then start up again, each time closer to a window or door. I moved as quietly as I could to each one, checking that it was locked tight. My heart was pounding, and with each step I took, I felt a rising dread that I couldn't shake. The footsteps stopped. I strained my ears, but all I could hear was the steady rain and my own breathing. I was starting to relax, telling myself it was probably nothing, just nerves. But then, in the next flash of lightning, I saw it. A tall figure standing just beyond the window. They stood completely still, close enough for me to make out their shape, staring in through the glass. I stumbled back, my hands shaking. The rain and wind were too loud to hear if they were saying anything, but it didn't matter. Their silent presence alone was enough to make me panic. I grabbed my phone, but of course, there was no signal this deep in the woods, especially in the storm. I was completely alone. Minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an hour, but the figure didn't move. They just stood there watching. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were waiting for something, maybe for me to make a mistake, to leave a door unlocked. Only the thin walls and a single lock stood between us. After what felt like forever, they finally moved away from the window. I held my breath, listening as they slowly moved around the cabin again, testing each window and door. I had checked every lock, but that didn't comfort me now. Then I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. The scrape of metal against the cabin door, like someone trying to pry it open. I grabbed the kitchen knife, the only thing I had, and backed up to the far side of the room, as far from the door as I could get. The scraping continued, then a loud thud as they tried to force the door. Each thunderclap seemed to make them push harder, each strike more desperate. I gripped the knife tightly, barely daring to breathe, listening to them struggle with the door. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. Silence filled the cabin, broken only by the constant rain tapping on the roof. I stood there, waiting, gripping the knife until my hands hurt. Finally, I gathered the nerve to look outside through the window. There was nothing there. No figure, no sound of footsteps, only the dark, rain-soaked woods. But then, just below the window, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. A muddy footprint, right by the door. It was fresh, smeared, and looked as if someone had been standing there for a while, just waiting. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, clutching that knife until the first light of dawn broke through the trees. When the storm finally cleared and I felt brave enough to step outside, I found more footprints all around the cabin. They circled the whole place, stopping at each window and door, like someone had been searching for a way in all night. I never saw the figure again, but those footprints left something chilling in my mind. They showed me that whoever was out there had spent the entire night trying to get inside. And as I looked at the cabin, it hit me. If I had missed even one lock, left even one window cracked, I might not have been standing there at all. The night was pitch black as I drove up the twisting road through the thick trees, my headlights barely making a dent in the fog hanging low. I had been on the road for hours to reach this tiny police station, hidden deep in the woods. I didn't know why they'd built it out here so far from everything. It was an old cabin turned into a station with only a couple of officers around, and it was usually dead silent. People only ever came here if a hiker got lost or a hunter wandered too far. But I'd heard stories. People talked about strange cases going way back, cases the officers here never really talked about. For most, it was just a job, a stepping stone to something better. When I pulled into the gravel lot, I noticed only two other cars parked there. A heavy, still silence hung over everything. The only sound was my boots crunching on the gravel as I walked up to the cabin door. The lights were on, and from outside, it looked like any other cabin out here in the woods. But as soon as I stepped inside, I felt it. A strange, heavy feeling in the air, something that twisted my stomach in knots. The walls were lined with photos of officers who had worked here over the years, each face staring blankly. It felt like those eyes followed me as I walked down the hall. One of the officers on duty nodded at me and pointed toward the room I'd be staying in. I walked down the hall, passing empty rooms that looked barely used, like they'd been cleared out in a hurry. Something felt wrong here, something I couldn't put my finger on, but I told myself it was just nerves. The last room down the hall was mine. It was tiny, with a narrow bed and a weak, buzzing light overhead. The air felt stale and the quiet made my skin crawl. I tried to sleep, but every little noise, the creaks in the walls, the soft rustling of trees outside, made me uneasy. I shut my eyes, hoping to block it all out, but then I heard footsteps. Slow, steady footsteps, right outside my door. They stopped. I held my breath, waiting, and then I heard them continue down the hall. I told myself it was just another officer doing a walkthrough, but I felt every muscle tense up. When I finally drifted off, I woke up suddenly to a thumping noise outside. It wasn't loud, but it had a steady beat, like something heavy hitting the ground over and over. I got up and looked out the small window. In the faint moonlight, I could see shapes moving among the trees. It looked like someone was dragging something big, something heavy, slowly through the woods toward the cabin. My mouth went dry. I wanted to believe it was just someone moving supplies or clearing brush. But at that hour, out here in the middle of nowhere, it made no sense. I crept to the door, pressing my ear against it, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The dragging sound got closer, and then it stopped. A shadow passed by the window, a tall, broad figure, and then it was gone, lost in the darkness. I stood there, holding my breath, waiting, as the silence wrapped around me again like a thick blanket. When morning finally came, I felt exhausted but relieved to see daylight. I packed up fast, eager to get out of there. As I walked out to my car, something caught my eye at the edge of the woods, partly hidden in the tall grass. It was a large black bag. The zipper was half open, just enough for me to see inside. I froze. Inside the bag was a dark, blood-stained jacket, with a badge still pinned to it. The name on the badge was one I recognized. It belonged to an officer who had gone missing a year ago. They'd said he must have quit suddenly, left without a word. But his jacket was here, stained and stuffed in that bag. I didn't tell anyone. I climbed into my car, left that place, and never looked back. But sometimes, when I'm alone, I can still feel those eyes on me, like I'm being watched, like something is waiting. And I know deep down that whoever was out there that night wasn't done. They're still out there in those woods, watching, waiting, looking for someone new to take. And someday, when I'm least expecting it, maybe they'll find me, just like they found him. I arrived at the cabin deep in the South American rainforest, the sky already heavy with dark clouds. I had come to escape the noise of city life, looking for peace among the tall trees and endless green. The rain started soon after I settled in, pounding against the roof like a loud drummer. At first, I felt cozy, wrapped in my blanket, listening to the steady beat of the rain. As night fell, the sounds of the forest grew louder. The wind howled through the trees, making strange whispers that seemed to call my name. I shook off the uneasy feeling creeping in. After all, I was alone in this remote cabin, far away from people. I turned on my flashlight and started to read, trying to distract myself from the shadows outside. Suddenly, I heard a rustling noise outside. I froze, the book slipping from my fingers. I listened hard, but the rain made it hard to tell where the sound was coming from. It didn't sound like the wind. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it out the window. The beam cut through the darkness, lighting up the trees, but there was nothing there. My heart raced as I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination. Then I heard it again, closer this time. It sounded like footsteps in the mud. I held my breath, feeling a chill run down my spine. I had locked the door earlier, but the thought of someone out there made me uneasy. I peered through the window again, scanning the dark, just shadows and rain. Then I saw something, a dark shape standing just beyond the tree line. I couldn't see any details, but it was definitely there, moving slightly as if watching me. My instincts kicked in. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. Panic set in. If something was out there, I was completely alone. I decided to block the door with the heavy furniture in the cabin. The rain kept pouring, drowning out my thoughts. My heart was pounding louder than the storm, and I fought the urge to look outside again. But curiosity got the better of me. I slowly moved to the window, my flashlight flickering as if it knew I was scared. I aimed the light at the figure, but it had disappeared. A wave of fear washed over me. Where did it go? My mind raced, thoughts spiraling as I checked the door one more time. The locks were secure. I tried to steady my breathing, but the air felt thick, and every creak of the cabin echoed in my ears. Then, out of nowhere, a loud crash came from the back of the cabin, followed by the unmistakable sound of breaking wood. My heart dropped. Someone had broken in. I had to move quickly. I grabbed a heavy metal lamp, holding it tightly as I made my way to the back room where the noise came from. My mind raced with thoughts. What if it was someone dangerous? I peeked around the corner, flashlight ready. The back door was wide open, flapping against the wall, rain pouring in like a wild river. I stood frozen for a moment, then stepped outside, determined to confront whatever was out there. The air was thick with humidity, mixed with the smell of wet earth and leaves. As I stepped into the rain, I scanned the area, hoping to see the figure, but all I found were shadows moving in the rain. The weight of silence hung around me, heavy and uncomfortable. Just when I thought I was imagining it, I heard a low growl. I turned quickly, shining my light toward the sound, and there it was, a wild dog, its eyes shining with fear and anger, cornered and ready to protect its space. I backed away slowly, realizing this was just an animal trying to defend its home, much like I was. I hurried back into the cabin, slamming the door shut behind me. My adrenaline began to fade, leaving me with a dull ache of fear in my chest. I had let my imagination run wild. With the rain still pounding outside, I finally allowed myself to breathe. The storm was fierce, but strangely, I felt calmer. I locked the door again, hoping the wild dog wouldn't come back. I settled back onto the couch, the rain a soothing sound after the chaos. I reminded myself I was safe inside, surrounded by the strong walls of the cabin. As the night went on, the storm began to calm down, and the tension in my chest eased. I drifted off to sleep, knowing I had faced my fears that night, even if it was just a wild dog. But I awoke to a different sound, a faint scratching noise coming from the walls, just below the window. I listened closely, my heart racing again. I sat up, shining my flashlight toward the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there. The scratching continued, now accompanied by a soft thumping. Felt like something was trying to get in. My pulse quickened, and I wished I had not locked the door so tightly. What if it wasn't just the dog? The scratching turned to a tapping, rhythmic and eerie. I grabbed my lamp, ready to defend myself. The noise stopped suddenly, replaced by a heavy silence. I held my breath, straining to listen. Then, I heard it, a whisper, soft and chilling, as if someone was right outside my window, trying to get my attention. I slowly approached the window, fear creeping into my gut. I raised the flashlight, aiming it at the glass, and the beam hit something just outside. The same dark shape from earlier, but now it was closer, hovering in the shadows. My stomach dropped as I realized I wasn't alone. I stepped back in horror, knowing that whatever it was could see me, and I could do nothing but wait, trapped inside my own cabin, while the storm outside raged on. Morning would come, but I knew that the darkness held its secrets. The wild dog wasn't the only thing lurking out there. I was just a visitor in a place that could swallow me whole, and I realized that no matter how safe I felt inside, the forest had a way of reaching back to those who disturbed its peace. I was sick of the city, so I rented a small cabin out in a thick forest upstate. I didn't plan to stay long, just enough to clear my mind and get away from all the noise. The cabin was way out there, tucked between tall trees and dense bushes, with only a narrow, bumpy dirt road leading back to town. Felt like the escape I needed. The first few days were peaceful. I'd start my mornings by the stream nearby, listening to the birds and watching the water trickle over the rocks. I took short hikes, got back to the cabin by evening, and settled in with a book as the sun went down. It was quiet, almost too quiet at times, but I liked being alone. On the fourth day, though, I noticed something strange. It was around dusk, and I was sitting on the porch just enjoying the view, when I saw a figure at the edge of the woods, maybe 50 yards away. He was just standing there, part hidden by the trees, looking right at me. I couldn't see his face, but he was tall and broad, wearing old, faded clothes. I stared back, not sure if he saw me, but after a few seconds, he turned and slipped into the trees without making a sound. I tried to brush it off as someone passing through, maybe a hiker or a hunter. Still, there was something about the way he stood there, so still and quiet, that gave me a strange feeling. That night, I locked the cabin door, feeling a bit foolish, but I couldn't shake the sense that someone was watching me. The next day, I decided to go on a longer hike, thinking it might clear my head. I ended up near the same spot where I'd seen the man the night before. I looked around and noticed something on the ground, footprints leading away into the trees. They were big, pressed deep into the dirt, like they'd been made by heavy boots. I wasn't sure if they were his, but the thought made me uneasy. I quickly headed back to the cabin. That night, I couldn't relax. The silence felt thick, and every little creak in the cabin seemed louder than normal. Around midnight, I thought I heard something outside, like leaves crunching underfoot. I got up, grabbed a flashlight, and looked out the window, scanning the tree line. Nothing. I told myself I was just on edge and tried to let it go, heading back to bed after a while. But sleep didn't come easy. I lay there, listening to every sound, feeling a creeping sense of dread that I couldn't shake. Eventually, just before dawn, I drifted off. The next morning, I'd had enough. I decided to pack up and head home. The cabin and the woods had started feeling strange, like I was intruding on someone else's space. But when I went outside to load up my car, my stomach dropped. There were muddy boot prints leading up to the cabin door. Fresh prints, clear in the dirt. They hadn't been there the night before. Someone had come up to the door while I'd been sleeping inside. My hands shook as I threw my stuff into the car, desperate to leave. As I drove away, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that figure standing in the road, watching me leave. It wasn't until I was miles down the road, finally back on the main highway, that I felt like I could breathe again. But even now, I can't get those boot prints out of my mind. The way they came right up to my door, and the feeling that whoever made them had been watching, waiting just outside, in the dark. Since that day, I've tried to forget about it. But every time I think about the cabin, I can see that shadow at the edge of the trees, that silent figure slipping away, and those boot prints leading right up to where I slept, alone, without any idea of what was lurking outside my door. And sometimes, I still wake up in the middle of the night, wondering if he's still out there, hiding in the woods, waiting for someone else to stay long enough to notice him too. I arrived at the cabin after a long drive, ready for a weekend away from the noise of the city. The cabin was tucked away at the edge of a thick forest, and it felt like the perfect getaway. But just a few hundred yards away, an old graveyard lay hidden behind tall trees. I had heard about it and read stories about strange things happening there at night. Still, I wasn't scared. I was just there to relax. The first day passed without a hitch. I spent hours hiking the trails, enjoying the peace and fresh air. The sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. I built a fire outside, roasting marshmallows while watching the stars slowly come out. As the darkness fell, the forest around me filled with sounds. Crickets chirping, leaves rustling, and the occasional snap of a twig. It was peaceful until I heard something different. A low noise came from the direction of the graveyard. At first, I couldn't figure out what it was. A rustle? A thump? I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was probably just a deer or some other animal. I went back into the cabin and locked the door, feeling a bit uneasy but convincing myself I was just being silly. I lay down to sleep, but rest wouldn't come. Every sound outside seemed louder, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. Hours slipped by and I finally fell asleep, but it didn't last long. I woke up to a loud bang outside. My heart raced as I lay still, straining to hear more. There was silence. I decided I would check it out in the morning. The next day, I explored the area, hoping to find where the noise had come from. I walked over to the graveyard, its old stones covered in weeds and moss. It felt creepy, but I was determined to see what was there. As I wandered among the graves, I saw some stones had fallen over, as if someone had messed with them. The air felt heavy, and I got a chill down my back, but I pushed forward. I spent the day hiking again, trying to distract myself from what I'd seen. But as night drew near, I knew I had to head back to the cabin. I cooked dinner and sat outside, listening to the sounds of the forest. Just as I started to relax again, I heard that same noise return. A loud thump followed by a scraping sound. This time it was closer. My heart felt like it was going to burst as I got up and moved to the edge of the clearing, trying to peer into the shadows. The moonlight barely broke through the trees, but I thought I saw a figure darting between the gravestones. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was just someone messing around, or maybe it was something far worse. I couldn't shake the sense of dread as I rushed back inside and locked the door. The noises continued, thumps, and then the unmistakable sound of something dragging along the ground. I felt trapped in my own cabin, fear gnawing at my insides. My phone had no signal, and the thought of stepping out into the darkness felt impossible. As the night wore on, the sounds grew louder, and I felt as if whatever was outside knew I was there. Suddenly, there was silence. I waited, holding my breath, listening. Then I heard it, a whisper, faint but clear. It seemed to come from right outside my window. It was a simple phrase, "Help me." My blood turned cold. I couldn't tell if it was real or if my mind was playing tricks on me. I grabbed a heavy flashlight and moved quietly toward the window, shining the beam into the dark. There was nothing, just trees and shadows. I backed away, trying to convince myself it wasn't real, but deep down, I knew I had to leave. When the sun finally rose, it cast a weak light over everything, stretching long shadows across the ground. I wasted no time packing my things, adrenaline rushing through me. I hurried to the door, my heart pounding. As I opened it, something made my stomach drop. There, on the ground, was a fresh grave, the dirt still turned over. I had no idea how I hadn't noticed it before. The earth was still damp, and a small wooden cross marked the spot. A wave of nausea hit me. I stumbled back into the cabin, ready to leave everything behind. The grave was a stark reminder that some places were better left alone. I felt a primal fear clawing at me as I turned to run. The whisper from the night echoed in my head. "Help me." I couldn't shake the feeling that I had disturbed something that should have been left undisturbed. As I got into my car, the weight of the graveyard pressed on my mind. I drove away, heart racing, vowing never to return. But as I looked in the rearview mirror, I swore I saw a figure standing by the cabin, watching me leave. The woods had whispered their secrets, and I felt that I hadn't escaped at all. I had only just begun to understand the darkness that lurked there. And as I left, I knew that the next time someone entered those woods, they might hear the same desperate call, "Help me," echoing through the trees.